Welcome to another episode of the Biohacking Beauty podcast. This episode is actually a solo episode I'm going to recording on my own. My name is Amitay Eshel. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Young Goose, the biohacking skincare company, the company that this product or this podcast is brought to you by. And this solo episode is something that we're going to try to do on a regular basis in order to educate about a specific topic that we feel is important for people to kind of learn about and know, and to give context to many things that are happening right now in the biohacking field or the longevity field. So this episode today is we're going to be diving into the science of NAD plus, or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. You're going to see me looking down a lot in this episode because I do have notes to make sure that we're covering everything I want us to cover. But we're going to be diving deep into what is NAD, why is that important for us as a whole, why is that maybe the hottest topic right now as far as longevity science and optimal performance. And we're going to learn how to increase it in our body, and we're going to see how it relates to skin health and appearance in general. What you will learn in this episode, again, is basically what NAD is, why it's important to us, and how we can elevate those levels in our body and our skin. Before we dive into today's episode, it would mean a lot to me and to us at Young Goose if you subscribed, if you made sure that you are getting the latest episode directly to where you're listening to podcast. And obviously that's going to also improve our exposure and the fact that it's going to kind of boost our algorithm, and many other people are going to be able to enjoy our podcasts. So this podcast, just before we dive in, I want to remind you guys that this podcast is brought to you by Young Goose, the biohacking skincare company, and that the products that we make at Young Goose are directed towards not only how your skin looks like, but how it functions, to make sure it functions like a younger functioning skin, rebooting it to its optimal performance. And then that is the best way to affect how your skin appears, looks like, and also obviously affect it for years to come, to make sure it looks and performs the best that it can. But without further ado, let's start today's podcast. So as I said before, what we are doing today is we're going to be talking about NAD. And NAD, or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, first of all, it's a cofactor. Okay, what it does, it assists enzymes in their chemical reactions. So it is an assisting molecule in over 600 processes in our body that include energy metabolism, DNA repair, immune activation, in general, many repair processes that we associate with how we look and how we function. They rely on NAD. One of them, which is very important, and we're going to be talking about pretty extensively today, is the activity of sirtuins, and we're going to cover what sirtuins are, and PARP, which is a family of so sirtuins are basically a class of enzymes that are involved in longevity, and PARPs are a family of DNA repair enzymes. So we're going to be talking about that. Before we dive into the function, it's important to understand that the reason NAD is interesting to us as far as longevity and optimal performance is because NAD declines, or the levels of NAD decline with age. And between the ages of 30 to 60, about half of the reservoir of NAD in our cells declines, and that affects every aging process, basically. So that decline leads to unrepaired damage, and the accumulation of unrepaired damage is basically what aging is. So it's very important to know what NAD is, how we can maintain high levels of it, and also how we can maintain high levels of it in different organs, because NAD expresses itself differently in different organs, and is being able to we can replenish the levels in different organs differently. And that's an important first point. So NAD is synthesized in the body. It can be synthesized from a few different molecules. One is tryptophan, which is amino acid. A few forms of vitamin B3 can do it as well. And in general, most of the NAD that our body has is being recycled. So it's basically being reproduced from used NAD, but some of it gets lost in the process, and that is where supplementation comes in, or that is where outside sources, again, such as tryptophan, or B vitamins such as niacin, nicotinamide riboside, NMN, which is nicotinamide mononucleotide, nicotinic acid, and other types of vitamin 3, B3, I'm sorry, that's how basically we can replenish those levels. They are not, so these precursors, which are basically building blocks for NAD, they're not located in the body in the same way. And we're going to be also looking at, again, different tissues and how we can replenish NAD there. Because as you know, in the Biohacking Beauty podcast and in general in Young Goose, we understand that if the body doesn't function optimally as an organism, then our skin's not going to look the best. So I can't just tell you guys, you know what, let's replenish NAD in our skin and everything's going to be okay. We're not going to look as old as, our age, our chronological age. No, it needs to work. The skin's an organ. It's a part of the body. So we really need to take care of the body as a whole in order to take care of our skin. So as I said before, the predominant way for our body to get NAD is through what we call the salvage pathway. The reason that it's important to us is because different precursors, and we're gonna be touching on that, actually react or interact with the salvage pathway differently. So the salvage pathway is the way that NAD is being recycled in the body. Every kind of used up NAD, it gets broken down. The salvage pathway kind of rebuilds it back to NAD or back to precursors, which then gets built up into NAD within our cell. And there are a few ways to kind of basically like activate that salvage pathway or affect that salvage pathway. So when cellular NAD levels are low, which can happen through fasting, caloric restriction, exercise, etc., that is when our body kind of ramps up its NAD production or recycling. And also there is basically so there are sensing. There's sensing when there are low NAD levels. Our body kind of ramps up that activity, especially in order to support our mitochondria, which is where we create energy in the form of ATP. So basically where our powerhouses of the cell reside. But in order not to get too complicated, we just want to make sure we understand that basically NAD synthesis, NAD, the ability for the body to create NAD, is dependent on stress. So when we stress the body, when there is a low level of NAD being detected, that's when the body is going to kind of produce more. And obviously, that is going to be a positive long-term effect on our body. There are two ways to kind of increase NAD exogenously from outside the body. One would be what we call supplementation. So supplementation on precursors. Not all precursors are the same as far as the ability to raise NAD levels. One would be a NAD precursor such as NR-NMN. Nicotinic acid and nicotinamide or niacinamide, they are not as potent as far as raising NAD levels, and they also have some issues with them. So normally the classic or the preferable way to raise NAD levels is with those precursors. And another thing is what we call stacks or sirtuin activating compounds. Those are either resveratrol or pterostilbene, which is closely resembling resveratrol. Those are normally found together in the same supplements, but not exclusively. So you can find them separately and supplement on them separately. So NAD, as far as hallmarks of aging, as far as the reasons that we want to kind of um, keep NAD at a high level, is because the NAD depletion, which I said already, is associated with aging, is also associated with increased NAD DNA damage, decreased autophagy, which is the recycling of dead cells or malfunctioning cells, and increased mitochondrial dysfunction, which is a big part of aging, which you are going to hear about more and more and more. There is another part of an aging hallmarks that is less talked about, which is called dysregulated nutrient sensing. So all of those things really are being affected by the depletion of NAD that happens with time. And again, we definitely want to work hard on raising NAD levels. Um, One of the problems with supplementing on NAD or NAD precursors, so first of all, supplementing on NAD as a whole, there is an issue there as far as bioavailability. So NAD doesn't really exist outside of our cells in our body. So our body has a hard time ushering it into the cell. That is why it is much better to take precursors such as NR or NMN, because the body does know what to do with them, does know how to get them into our cells. And obviously, that way we get more NAD in the cell rather than just supplementing on NAD. As far as NAD IVs, which become very popular, in the past, I used to be quite skeptical about NAD IVs. But due to recent studies, I am less skeptical. And the reason is because when they did have studies of people getting NAD IVs, um, the first, what they did is they had them take a pretty low dose, which is 750 milligrams over a 6-hour period. And for the first 2 hours, they did not see any NAD in the plasma, which means that all of it got uptaken by muscle tissue. After that, they did see higher levels of NAD in the plasma, which means there was kind of topping off of the ability of the muscle tissue to absorb NAD. As far as supplementation, the problem is that 95%, as far as research shows, 95% of NR or NMN direct translation to NAD happens in the liver. The rest happens throughout the rest of the body. And when we made our first NAD product, which is a skin cream called Care, and now we also have it in a product called Eye Care, we used both NR and NMN as precursors. We nano-size them and create a lipid layer that protects them for stability. The reason we did it to begin with is because the skin doesn't get a lot of upregulation of NAD or NAD synthesis through ingesting those molecules, and also not as far as IVs. There are other, it's called preference basically of cells. So there are cells that are much more preferable. They have basically a higher demand for NAD, or NAD is much more inclined to get a rising of NAD levels there in those cell types, such as heart, brain, muscle tissue, liver, internal organs, and your skin doesn't really enjoy that much that supplementation. And that's why we created a product that directly raises NAD levels in the skin. As far as mitochondrial function, which I already mentioned, that is a big part of why we want raised NAD levels. Our mitochondria depends on NAD in order to create energy. Obviously, that energy is the reason our cells function. So proper energy levels, which is coming in the form of ATP, allows the cells to do whatever they need to do, whether it is lower inflammation, fight off infection, create collagen for our skin cells, etc., etc., etc. Another issue with NAD, which we did already speak of before a little bit, is those sirtuins and PARP. The reason I really want to hammer it home, so sirtuins basically If you've ever heard about Dr. David Sinclair from Harvard, he wrote a book called Lifespan, which is basically a book about sirtuins and NAD. Highly recommend. Obviously, it's a New York Times #1 seller. I highly, highly, highly recommend this book. And in this book, he explains that through stress, our body senses stress and kind of goes into repair mode. That repair mode, among other processes, is dependent on sirtuins, which are kind of they're called our longevity genes or anti-aging genes, and the enzymes that they encode are dependent on NAD. So if there is enough NAD, they work. If there's not enough NAD, they just don't work. And that's why it's so important to maintain high NAD levels, because it's not like our car. It's going to drive the same whether we have half a tank of gas, full tank, close to zero, right? The empty tank is already showing, but the car would drive the same until it stops. Not the same with sirtuins and with other enzymes such as PARPs. What happens is if there isn't enough NAD, they just are not going to work. Now, it sounds like because both PARP, what basically corrects DNA damage, and sirtuins both rely on NAD, it sounds like they should both work with high levels of NAD. But what happens with age, especially in our skin, is that more and more and more DNA damage is being accumulated. And actually, new research shows that most of what we recognize as skin aging has got to do with the damage of UV radiation and also blue light to our DNA, rather than the normal attrition of our cellular function, which is associated with normal aging. So it's more about the damage that we're getting to our DNA from the sun. So that accumulates mainly in our skin. And what happens is that PARPs become a dominant consumer of NAD, and our sirtuins low. Because why does that happen? Because now there is more demand for correction of DNA damage, and our sirtuins do not have NAD that is required for them to function, so they just don't function. So you can imagine how that would snowball to obviously to more and more problems that are connected with age. Just a few words about circadian rhythm. That is not necessarily about our skin, but our circadian rhythm, which is the way that our body manages its hormone production, and in general, its kind of clock that it has in every cell in our body, as far as what the cells need to do in specific times of day, is also dependent of NAD. And obviously, correct levels of NAD allow us to function correctly during the day, and vice versa. Not enough levels would be a problem as far as being able to wake up with energy, repair ourselves during the night, etc. Going back to the way that we can affect it is by supplementing on NAD. I would want to say that as far as supplementing on NAD peaks 8 hours after supplementation. And when I all the time say supplementing on NAD, we've already established that supplementing on NAD precursors such as NR and NMN is a better idea than supplementing on straight up NAD. And we're gonna preface that there are two cells that can actually uptake NAD directly, and that is our heart and our skin cells. Our heart and our brain cells. And that is why if you look at specific supplements that are designed to raise NAD levels in the brain, such as Nadovim, NADOVIM, they actually use straight up NAD, which might be a good idea if you wanted to do only that. But that I haven't seen research showing that specifically. But having said that, those are the two cells that can kind of usher directly into them NAD. The rest, you would need to use a precursor, because generally your cells don't take up NAD as a molecule. They need the precursors. Now, there are two dominant precursors in circulation right now. One is NR, or nicotinamide riboside. The other is nicotinamide mononucleotide, or NMN. Why would one be preferred as far as supplementation? That's remain to be seen. As far as the product that we made, Care and eye care, obviously the patent is called NR Noble, but it actually has both molecules, has both NR and NMN, because both seem to be working the same, but they kind of cap off at a certain point, so it's better to use both of them. NR is patented. It's patented by a MIT PhD. It's called Dr. Banner, and that is why there is a lot of money in kind of proving that it's a better precursor. On the other hand, David Sinclair out of Harvard is the person behind much of the research about NMN, and he's kind of pushing NMN, or he refers to NMN every time he talks about NAD upregulation. So there is ego and there is money behind each of the supplements or each of the precursors. Just bear that in mind. We just use both. As far as supplementation and how much to take, that's an interesting discussion. So as far as rodent models and most studies that have been done as far about NAD and NR, the equivalent in humans would be around a gram to even 2.2 grams. When we buy supplements, normally the dose is around 200 to 300 milligrams. It does tend to get expensive after that. If you can afford, supplementing on a gram, that might be positive for you. If you want to be more cautious and leave it within what the dosage on the bottle says, it's around probably 250 is the average, but 2 to 300 you'll see as far as milligrams. NR, the official supplement is called True Niagen. You can also find NR in Thorn, which have a product called Resveracel that actually also has pterostilbene as well, and it also has trimethylglycine, which is a methyl group. And the reason it has that is because when we do convert the precursor to NAD, we sacrifice methyl groups, so it's a good idea to replenish those methyl groups. If you are interested in the ratio, if you are not taking a complete supplement that has everything, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So if I took, for example, 500 milligrams of NMN, I'm going to take 250 milligrams of TMG or other methyl group. This is a pretty cheap supplement, so it's not an issue as far as whether you should take it or not. It's a few dollars, and if you're already taking NAD precursors, you should take that. One of my favorite ways to raise NAD levels, again, stressing our body would creating a need of energy, or depleting our energy will create a demand for NAD. So a few ways that we can raise NAD levels, again, is intermittent fasting in general, and exercise, especially high intensity interval training or weight training. So that is a great way to raise NAD levels and make sure that we have enough NAD long-term in our cells in order to facilitate cell repair. So that was, guys, a little solo episode about NAD, the importance of it. Of course, Young Goose started as a company that offers, our first product was an NAD skincare product that was called, as I said, Care, that had the patent NR Noble that has both NR and NMN, but also a plethora of other ingredients, over 10 other ingredients that tie up to that raise in NAD levels. So CoQ10 and PQQ for mitochondrial support, lowering inflammation through turmeric. It had B vitamins, and of course, patented form of resveratrol, which is called, which, if you remember, this is a STAC, a sirtuin activating compound, which is fermented, and that increased its bioavailability. The reason resveratrol is not very bioavailable in the skin, as opposed to the gut, as opposed to taking a supplement, is because in our skin we are lacking the enzyme to break resveratrol down. The same enzyme that we have in our gut does not exist in the skin. So what we did is that we made up that or introduced that enzyme in the fermentation process of resveratrol. So we ferment resveratrol, introduce that enzyme within the fermentation process. That makes it 50 times more bioavailable and non-toxic. Then later on, we introduced our NAD precursors into our eye care, which is a version of our care. But for the eyes, I did not mention that care had a few proprietary peptides that we were using there. For the eye care, we went with peptides that are more congruent with negation of glycation, which is another hallmark of aging, because glycation makes the skin around the eyes rigid, thinner, and more susceptible to wrinkling. So by using, for example, the copper peptide GHKCU and other peptides, we were able to negate glycation and thicken the skin there, which also prevents puffiness, dark circles, and of course helps with wrinkles, crow's feet, etc. Again, guys, thank you very much. That was our solo podcast, or my solo podcast, about NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. You can find a lot of information online about NAD. The purpose of this podcast was really to get you up to speed. If you hear about NAD in our podcast, so you have an idea what it does and why it is important to us. Again, it's involved almost in any repair process in our body, and it lowers with age. So that's, if I can quote Davis and Claire from Harvard, that is the closest we have gotten to the fountain of youth. That's the first product that we came out with, and we're very proud to be the best product for NAD for the skin that is available on the market. Again, if you're interested in any of our products, go to younggoose.com. The NAD precursors that are called NR Noble are both in care concentrated moisturizer and eye care. And of course, you can combine it with any of our other products to improve their effect. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, great week, and we will be here next time on the Biohacking Beauty podcast. Thank you very much.